Aloha, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are on this fast forward planet, wrapped in so many layers of turbulent, rapid change. It's hard for folks to keep track. Today's show here on Sustain What? I'm Andy Revkin in Maine, includes people in Zurich, Switzerland, and Kauai, Hawaii. So we have a bunch of time zones represented. And really happy to be able to have a discussion of how technology, the powerful computer tools, data gathering, data monitoring, and then communication using data in ways that can immerse decision makers, whether it's a homeowner or a mayor or a planner or a business, in how to future proof is a word that's tough. We're not proof. We're not going to be waterproof, water resistant. Future resistant is a good word. There's so much change, as I said, and there are layers of it. So if you're not thinking about fire, flood, and other things at the same time, you can actually set yourself up for worse problems. And we're going to talk about how technology can help cut climate and coastal risks, particularly. Just yesterday, I did a pop-up show on Juneau, Alaska, which has now a chronic issue with the suicide basin up in the mountains that accumulates meltwater from glacier, and the glacier periodically lets go of it. And luckily, they had limited losses yesterday because they were prepared. They have really good websites and tools through the investments we make as taxpayers to monitor and then forecast what's going on with these hazards like that one, a glacial lake outburst flood. Kauai and Hawaii generally face a range of hazards. Uh, you're just in a geohazard hotspot. A lot of the most beautiful places in the world happen to be hazardous. So today we're going to hear from Alan Clinton, who is a planning officer for the County of Kauai and is working on ways to foster better decision making and community inclusion in making those decisions. And also from ESRI, this giant company many of us have never heard of, that maps the world and makes storytelling through information more feasible. Taisha Fabricius, hoping I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. You're in Zurich, Switzerland, and you're involved with, you're sort of a lead on technology applications for resilience and this kind of thing. Thank you both for being here this evening. And maybe we'll start with, I wanted to ask you each, why are you focusing your skills on this particular situation, which keeps you up at night, I'm sure, and wakes you up early in the morning, depending on the dangers and other things you're working on. And maybe Alan out in Kauai, what got you into this fix?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andy. And it's kind of funny because I oftentimes have this conversation about geohazards and some challenges. And I usually tend to say we have every single hazard known to man with the exception of tornadoes, really. But I guess glacial risks also, I don't think, are super present here in the state of Hawaii, even though we do have some snow and ice up on Hawaii Island sometimes. But GIS has really turned into an amazing tool for us to engage with our community, to communicate complicated data, and more so, especially with compound risks, compound hazards. We realize that we need to be able to communicate a snapshot of information to a very wide variety of stakeholders. And with, as I mentioned, with these compound hazards, that stakeholder list is growing, not just from planners and engineers, but also to economists, to folks in emergency management, folks that work on mitigation. And so oftentimes I will have some difficulties communicating some of the intricacies of a lot of these hazards, these challenges, the rules, policies, and programs that we implement if we don't have an hour to explain them in a lot of depth. And so having these tools gives us a lot more flexibility to kind of create a snapshot of the collective hazard risk, who the different stakeholders are, and provide a much more nuanced and tailored approach to communicating a lot of our hazard risks and potential mitigation solutions.
Well, especially when you add rapid change in the picture. Climate is changing, biodiversity is changing, like the wildfire in Maui, the horrible situation there was a function of agriculture and other conditions that are not the way they were a few years ago. I'm recalling Ian McHarg was this great data visualizer from the 1960s, and he would meet with a city like Minneapolis, and he would have his Mylar overlays.
Yep.
Here's the geology, here's the water, and now it's very different. Now, Taisha, that brings us to you. So what got you focused on this arena? You obviously, having technical skills, you could be working on anything.
Yeah, very true. No, for me, I'm going to throw a few cliches into here probably, but like for me, it's always been about, I want to be working on something that I feel like I have an impact doing. So yeah, you know, there is no planet B. I'm here for a short amount of time in all of this. So I want to, you know, do my best to make it count. And I feel like, yeah, working for a company like ESRI in my case now, it gives me the opportunity to create tools, software products, all these things that people like Alan are able to use on the daily, that's actually helping people like Alan make a difference. Yeah, and that difference happens then all around the world. And then hopefully, eventually, we're all better prepared for everything that lies ahead.
I'm trying to, oh, here we go. I was trying to get something set up here. And here's one of the portals where some of these tools now exist. For those who don't know the phrase ArcGIS, maybe Taisha, you could explain what's the back end of something like this?
I mean, so there's, yes, ArcGIS is Esri's system, I'm going to say. Lots of different products and things come together to create what we call ArcGIS. Yeah, which is in this case now a web-based application. This is obviously Alan Kauai's open data hub. So within this data hub, it's pulling together lots of different information that I'm sure Alan can speak a little bit more to.
Yeah, and we'll get into that, Alan, and then we're going to step back from Kauai into the global picture. So, Alan, you know, you ticked off some of the threats and hazards and dynamics that you have to keep track of there in your job. How do you work to translate that into information and useful format?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and we've been really excited and fortunate over the last, I'd probably say about 15, 20 years on Kauai, that we've been able to pair a variety of different web-based applications, different data sources with our actual regulatory framework for development. And so we're really trying to move beyond just making recommendations for change and helping people help Kauai create a regulatory environment that, to use some of your terminology, doesn't necessarily expand our development and to areas that could sort of increase the size of that target for potential hazards. And so that's sort of where we're really hoping to implement philosophies of geodesign and have a much better understanding of the lay of the land when it comes to our hazard landscape to reduce risk overall. And while we can do our best to plan away from hazards and particular constraints, we realize that certain hazards will come to us if we are not active in managing vegetation, if we don't handle our more upstream watersheds, and a lot of that, and I think this is really where our work on Kauai has been a bit interesting, is the jurisdictional landscape of a lot of these hazards is also very interesting when it comes to mapping laws, rules, regulations, who the stakeholders are. And I'm not really sure if there's anybody who's super interested in being a legal mapper, but in some sense that's a space that we're moving into, is trying to have a better understanding of how the law applies to different areas, and oftentimes in a changing sense. Andy, you'd mentioned the hazards certainly change, but our data is now changing. It's being updated.
Right.
And that's something that we've actually baked in with that sea level rise constraint district right there. We actually embedded, so that web app that you can select and click on, we actually embedded this into the ordinance formally. So this digital application is part of that law. And so while we worked with the University of Hawaii to procure the data, they had done a statewide initiative. When the new data is available, the goal is to be able to have this tool absorb the new data so that we're using the latest and greatest science to inform our regulation. And so it's a much easier legislative lift to update the data in an online viewer than it is to create a new policy from scratch and go through the whole legislative process. And so we've been really excited on that front. And more so as we're exploring new policies, we're able to do something similar with some other hazards that we're starting to explore.
So Taisha, before we get into actually, this is part of the wider picture. I've written a lot about wildfire risk, and not just in Maui, but California, Colorado, Portugal, Greece. And one of the things that came up in California earlier this year with the horrific Pacific Palisades fire was things like grandfathered conditions. You have whole neighborhoods that burned badly because they didn't have to heed the current building codes. So somehow mapping, I think I might have even mentioned this in a wishful way in a story. Wouldn't it be great if we knew, using whatever means, where you have pockets of vulnerability in a community? Where are there still wooden shingle roofs, or where are homes not adequately buffered with? Is that the kind of thing you're thinking about, or where's the chicken and the egg? Do communities come to you, and how does ESRI interrelate with those kinds of problems?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Obviously, like we have the tools here to help to sort of answer these questions or give people more insights into potential vulnerabilities, things like that you just mentioned. But the cities, the county, like the different areas, the different, in our case, like consumers need to actually be using it, right? Because everything in this world has a location in some way, shape, or form. Everything can be anchored into the real world. And so if we sort of create, so in my line of work, the word digital twin is pretty common. If we're creating something like a digital twin of specific areas, cities, those sort of things, we can actually use these tools to support decision making, which is why sorry.
Although you know what it sounds like there, you're taking me back to Juneau, where there's a community organization that's very eager to solve their flood problem. And it's community driven because the community has to pressure politicians who then can find the tools. I guess this gets to why we're doing a webcast like this. If the let me see if I can get it on screen. If the Juneau flood solution advocates, and maybe they already are in touch with ESRI, if they want to create something, a package to take to their city council meeting and say, you're allowing development along this part of the river and it's a bad idea, where they can present the data. Is that the kind of thing that's possible? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, everything in the world can be mapped. It's just, the question is it being done? Who's doing it? Exactly those sort of things. But absolutely, in this case, it would be, if it's being mapped, we can visualize it. We can interact with the data that's being shown. We can look at things and experience things in different ways. And that ultimately helps in decision-making processes.
That's great. So we're going to get into the decision-making process now. And I had dealt with this in the past, like Arizona State University, I remember, has this decision theater process that they've had for a very long time. I think I first learned about it 15 or 20 years ago. And it's kind of like literally the idea is your city council is there mulling a zoning change and the data are there, or for national security, this is used, at a big scale, probably with wargaming. And then I do remember, and this is also probably 15 years old, I love it. there's this tool. It's almost like a museum artifact, Stop Disasters game, that the UN Disaster Risk Organization put together a long time ago, and school students can become the mayor of a coastal village and decide to play out a tsunami. Everyone should go to stopdisastersgame.org and check it out sometime. And then, you invest in mangroves, it's cheap, or you invest in moving houses, which is expensive. And then you see the result, and hopefully you learn and adjust. And that takes us to, I could actually play out the thing, but we probably don't have time. See, it gives you all that stuff. I love it. Maybe there's ESRI. Well, I know you do a lot of stuff for the classrooms too. If we all took that class, I think we'd be safer. But now true. let's get from this wacky model, which is great, to your form of immersion. And actually, you can start to talk about it while I switch screens. It'll take a second.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, yeah, what you've just shown here, obviously in a game environment, like we are at a point now where we can essentially do this in the real world, right? It's not a game anymore, because you can recreate your city again, digital twin, and then run things like simulations, right? So, yeah, I mentioned sort of experiencing your data in different ways, and so I think in this case, it's also like, why immersive? So why are we going in this direction? Is it because it's cool and it looks good? Is it, because the tech is new? It's not new, but newly sort of more evangelized and adopted in this case. But it's more than just a visualization, right? It is actually helping you in different ways. So I've got here, like from browser into a headset, there's different ways for you to experience your data, in different ways to immerse yourself in data.
So tell us what we're looking at here.
Gladly. So this is a web-based application, right? For some, maybe not immersive. For others, this is very immersive because it's a 3D application. And so this is Zurich. There's a river going through Zurich called the Sil, and we're simulating now, what would happen if we increase the water flow. And so this is a simulation that we're visualizing in the web, and you can actually then see the impact that it would have, the actual flooding that would occur, and then what the impacted buildings are and how heavily they're impacted. So this is already, a more immersive way of seeing data, right? Of course, this data exists also in table form, right, for example, or in charts and maps of some sort. But actually being able to see it helps a lot. And then taking it even further, sort of on the full, like bigger immersive perspective, like here we are, this is it's called a BIM model, Building Information Model. This is the actual Stuttgart main station, modeled obviously very, very exactly for urban planning, for architecture. But actually being able to go in now in this case and walk through and actually experience the data sort of at human scale, that again, that just helps with making the right decisions ultimately. And we've got there's a product called XR Viewer at ESRI. So this is one sort of example. It's this cross-industry application where it just really pulls in data that you have. In this case, it's a volcanic eruption, so Mount St. Helens. So you can see what the volcano was, and then it erupted, and so now you can see what was actually blown off in the volcanic eruption. So seeing it from this perspective changes things than just seeing it, even on a regular screen in 3D in this case, like, because you're actually inside the data. So
that's great. And volcanoes are something I've written about before, and it's hard for people sometimes to understand the risk in a community because of the long time scale. You can have, like, I'm going to show you. Let's go back in time to something I was writing about. There's a geographer named Stephen Strader who maps what they call expanding bullseye. This is the map of human development in zones of hazard. And they've done it in all kinds of situations, volcano, flood, wildfire, and he'd be a great guy to get on here. But what was so striking once, talking to him, let me see if I can get this. Oh yeah, I was at a meeting in Mexico on disaster risk communication, and I pointed to his work on this is Seattle. This is Seattle, and this is how many people are building, how many people are housed around the zones of pretty significant volcano hazard there. And he said this interesting thing. While I was at this meeting, I reached out to him on Twitter. And he said, "I'm not much of a land use planning or policy expert. While my expertise lies in the realm of examining hazards and how those are changing through time, my knowledge about what is being done from a disaster preparedness or land planning standpoint is limited. I can only comment on what I believe needs to be done." So he's not in the decision science space. How much of this, we have the tools we're talking about, which are great, but how much needs to be done to integrate arenas, experts in these different realms? And maybe to you, Alan, on that, because that seems like a really important part of making this more than just a cool widget.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we alluded to this a little bit at the beginning, but realizing that it really does take the whole community oftentimes to move forward with these approaches. And so I think that is reflective in the way that we try to assemble our visualizations, our data, our planning processes to ensure that it's accessible and really tailored to our community's needs. And here on Kauai, that means also understanding the human geography, the cultural features, how people feel about different spaces, what we're learning for discussions about things like manage retreat, or trying to move away from hazardous zones. It's very expensive to relocate physical public infrastructure. And at the same time, too, people are really hesitant to move away from the community that defines their identity. And so even though they may be in a hazardous area, what we've been seeing throughout our discussions about managed retreat, coastal hazards, is really until those hazards are lapping up against the actual structure, or so that there's some type of property failure so that your structure or your house is no longer livable, that's really where people more often than not start to get the comfort with the idea of relocation. But before that, it can be a really hard communication challenge. And so as planners, we want to be mindful that we don't expand that bullseye, so to speak, and realize that the combination of private property rights with sense of place attachment create really strong barriers to prevent relocation. And we need to be sensitive to all of our community's concerns. But that does present a need for us as a planning department, as a county, to not only be planning for the future, but we realize that we're gonna have to accommodate some of these hazards. And so how do we adapt in place as well, is another question that we're trying to navigate and communicate different types of information and data to homeowners, to assessors who do home inspections. And so it's incredibly important for us as planners to have a platform to customize, tailor, and make these data available to the people who need it. So I think we're moving in that direction more and more to kind of provide the information to contextualize these really challenging decisions.
That reminds me of the conversation I did after the Maui, the Lahaina fire in Maui, that included someone working with the indigenous Hawaiian community on mapping the cultural and ecological history of Lahaina, which was very revelatory in terms of hazard and future planning and the like. And I assume, I know Taisha, I know ESRI has worked with indigenous communities in different parts of the world, and certainly they harness your storytelling tools. Maybe you could just talk about that, like who does the mapping, how important is it to have that full dimensional conversation to build the decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, you know, everything we're talking about today, it's everyone's problem. Everyone needs to do their part in some way, shape, or form, right? And that means, yeah, obviously corporations working together amongst one another, working together with the public, of course. Alan mentioned making sure that information is available to the public, giving people ways to you know, add information to these different databases, to make sure that we've got open standards as well. Like, you know, obviously coming from a technological perspective, but yeah, it is on us as technology providers, and I don't mean just ESRI, I mean in general, right? That the work that everybody does do, that all kind of can play together as well, right? Because that is the way that we're going to actually, yeah, help to make a difference.
Oh, that's really good. That's a really important point too. The in Hawaii, in Kauai, are there examples that have already come to the fore? Like, what's for Alan? What's urgent for you, or in that sense? You know, I was going to ask you about the tsunami. That recently occurred in the Pacific that generated there was significant uncertainty about how bad the waves would be. But you know, does the sea level rise work also informs inundation? The inundation question is just different in terms of speed, but how do you adapt and adjust to that kind of thing?
Yeah, so it was very unfortunately timely in some sense for this discussion. We got notified, I believe, around I think maybe 1:45 locally or 2 o'clock that the earthquake had occurred, and at first it was reported at 8.0 magnitude, and realizing that was already one of the more close to the top 20 of the most significant earthquakes recorded on record. Knowing on Kauai historically that we've had earthquakes in the Aleutians and other areas in the 40s and 50s that did lead to very substantial sort of social and private property losses. And so there is certainly a known familiarity with tsunami hazards in the state of Hawaii, generally speaking. It's still in the collective knowledge of many of our kapuna and the elderly in our community. And so this was a very interesting event. And as soon as I saw it had gone up to an 8.8, we had already been on our way to the Emergency Operations Center to start providing GIS support to our incident management team. It was in 2018 when we had it's sort of called a rain bomb, we just call it, an overwhelming amount of rain. We had hit a national rainfall record of about 49.4 inches within a 24-hour period. And that created substantial flooding on the north shore of Kauai. And so I think every single year from 2018 through all of COVID, we had a federally declared disaster ongoing on Kauai. And so our incident management team and our response folks have been, we don't always ask for more hazards, but they've become very well trained and familiar with a lot of these tools. We leverage the ESRI platform for our damage assessments. And we've been able to integrate even with things like Motorola solutions and others that handle our radios so that we can communicate to police and immediately showcase on all of their officers in the field displays where the tsunami hazard zones are, the extreme and the regular tsunami zone hazard areas, and they were able to establish roadblocks to prevent people from going into these locations while the tsunami was approaching Kauai. So we were very fortunate that we were able to link those systems together for a coordinated response. And on Kauai, we only saw, I don't want to guess, but we were watching live the transmission of the ocean level, and for the most part here on Kauai, we didn't experience lots of wave overtopping. We saw a gradual rise of the ocean and then a lowering. So we were really fortunate and lucky because a 6.8 magnitude earthquake had done devastation to Hawaii in the past. And so an 8.8, which is, I think, 7th most powerful in history, certainly warranted a full activation of our emergency response team.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, I've written about the Cascadia threat, which on the Pacific Northwest, which anyway, the Pacific is a unifying thing when it comes to earthquake risk, because 300 and something years ago, when the earthquake in 1700 on that Pacific Northwest fault offshore Cascadia, the only reason folks know it happened was because they recorded it in Japan in the year 1700 on that day, the day the waves arrived. So it's important to pay attention and make sure data flows speedily. And it's also important for people to understand that there's not, thinking of something as a false alarm is probably a mistake. I don't know, Alan, if you get some of that feedback sometimes. Where does precaution end and overreaction begin? You must deal with those kinds of challenges.
Yeah, and by all means, I think we are very familiar, because Kauai actually doesn't have a roadway network that fully connects around the island. It's a bit of a horseshoe. And so parts of Kauai, even with just hard rain events, oftentimes can trigger flash flooding events. And so it's more common than not that we will have to close down certain bridges, access ways. And so parts of our community are more familiar with being cut off and not always having access to services. And so there is some degree of cultural and local knowledge about preparing your home, having your to-go kit, having these items prepared so that when you may get isolated, you will still have some resources and access. So it's certainly been, we certainly want to err on the side of caution. Nobody wants to have their day disrupted and sit in the line of cars for 8 hours trying to get down into a coastal area or a coastal road. But it was a really great test run too, in all of our systems, the technologies, the integrations, the use of pretty much the full platform of the ArcGIS solution really delivered. And so everybody was really excited. And we have our after action response brief out next week, so we're looking forward to see if there's things we can learn from.
That's great. Let's talk through the sea level example. You had sent some slides, and we can start with this one and just walk through some of the tool and what it generates. Hold on one second. So just Alan, maybe a little more from you on how this works.
Yeah, and Andy, if you want that first slide, that photo there, it may be a good point of, it's a great point of departure as we've sort of been discussing the discussion about jurisdiction, about boundaries, who are the stakeholders, who are the people that have a say. And this is it's a stunning photo, but it's probably one of the more challenging locations to navigate a variety of these discussions. On the left side of this photo is the Hanapepe salt beds. And it's a cultural feature, Pa'akai harvesting, salt harvesting. So there's cultural elements embedded here. It is a county beach park. The highest wash of the highest wave of the highest tide is where state property begins, and it's a state discussion. Up ahead, you have a state airstrip, which also has federal regulations and the FAA. So this isn't one of those locations where it's a photo that just communicates immediately all of the different stakeholders that will, for active management of a space, need to be consulted, and how complicated it can be to get everybody on board, not necessarily always to achieve consensus, but at a minimum to try to cooperate. And so there's in the discussion about preparing our community for coastal hazards, the next slide articulates the first sort of step that we went through with regards to preparing for chronic erosion of our beaches and the subsequent effects. And so the photo on the right is actually a photo from Oahu. And you can see there's a lot of sort of emergency efforts being put in informally, oftentimes without permits, and houses falling into the ocean. And this is a huge problem for our beaches, which are locations for gathering, locations for resource collection. They're really important community spaces. And we've been trying to find ways that we can really thread the needle on balancing community impacts and private property rights. And so the little viewer on the left actually indicates data that we integrated into something called a shoreline setback ordinance. And so this is another ESRI application that we brought our data into. And this is my favorite snapshot of this area because there is a small boat harbor smack dab in the middle of that beach. And you can see just based off of the coloring on the left, it is leading to a disruption of the movement of sand, of wave energy. And so those properties on the left are dramatically facing chronic erosion at a rate of about, I believe that transect is 3.5 feet per year. And so that is substantial. And on the right of that, it's a growing beach that is gaining sand. And so we've been very mindful of trying to limit shoreline hardening because we realize these are dynamic natural ecosystems that require some fluctuations. And so our shoreline setback ordinance was a really great stepping stone for how we integrate science and sort of satellite imagery to evaluate the march of the beach inland or as it grows and bring it into a regulatory policy. And so if anybody wants to develop in these areas, they have to be mindful of the location of the future shoreline. And then we will require a certified shoreline to be made based off of this a particular equation and that historical rate will then require these structures to be moved away from the shore to limit the potentiality of the scenario on the right. And the last thing I want to add on this is an instance where we've 3 times now redone the survey using satellite imagery and have updated the data in the policy to reflect the latest and greatest science. And so that was sort of a key element. And then the other interesting element is that this was still using historic data, so observed conditions. And so I think later on we'll talk a little bit more about how we integrate data with the Sea Level Rise Constraint District, which is novel in a sense because we were using data that have predictive elements to it. We're trying to, the question then becomes, does the law respect in private property rights, does the law respect our best predictions about the future to require behavior change in our built environment? And that's where the Sea Level Rise Constraint District became a bit of a discussion point because we are requiring people to elevate their structures similar to the FEMA flood program, but using data that's forward-looking rather than historic. And that's sort of where the question then becomes a little bit larger, is navigating the legal pathways, pairing the right mitigation practice to the right data, and figuring out how those can work in tandem is really that's sort of where the proof in the pudding is where we are trying to figure out the best way to integrate all of these pieces and not lead to a lawsuit every single day. And so this constraint district was adopted in 2020, and we haven't yet been sued on this, and that's encouraging. The interesting thing, though, is it's also useful to understand what the courts have to say about these types of practices. And so we haven't necessarily seen full similar types of deployments like this in other locations because there still is some uncertainty about, from a private property rights standpoint, forcing people to elevate their structures and change their building behavior based off of our best predictions about what will happen.
God, that's really interesting. Taisha, are there other, I don't know if you or others at ESRI keep track around the world of where predictive capacity is actually changing the law or changing the capacity to sell politically a more rigorous, future-oriented, not future-proof, but future mitigated outcome.
Yeah, I mean, there's many cities around the world that are adopting, this sort of forward-thinking approach, which is great. Like, I mean, obviously, Kauai, a great example. But then we've got in Europe, for example, I mean, Zurich, which is what I just showed you before too, with the flooding of the river. But then also, yeah, like cities like Prague, Singapore, yeah, lots of cities around the world that are, realizing that, in order to preserve what we have, or yeah, what's the word I'm looking for? Like preserve what we have, but also improve what we have. We need to do this based on data, and as Alan said, not just historic data, but also, simulations of what could happen.
And I'll quickly jump in there. I forgot to mention the thing that sometimes I forget, that we're having a larger global conversation. A lot of the stuff that I just described is mostly just due to the constitutional confines of the sort of U.S. framework that we're kind of enmeshed in. So yes, by all means, there's some amazing work throughout the world, but I guess my comment about the legal opportunity here is more confined to U.S. instances.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. The geography of decision making is different everywhere. But I am noticing more communities are being forced essentially by nature, by the realities of change, environmental change. This relates to things like invasive species as well, but certainly climate change and coastal change, into changing their rules and laws. In the insurance world, I think, is another arena, of course, where there's a lot of push to do this kind of thing. In a perfect world, Taisha, I assume every town or community will have some kind of way to, at a town meeting, be looking at a screen and
Yes.
using data actively in their debates. Is that part of what you
100%. Yeah, that is the perfect world, the utopia, I think, at this point. But I mean, what we are seeing is, I mentioned big cities, but there is also smaller cities, smaller villages that are also, adapting some form of what we're discussing here now. Something that works for them, and again, something that allows for collaboration. Yeah, because that's ultimately how things are gonna get done, right?
Well, and we live in a world right now where, unfortunately, there's so much falsehood and disinformation that it's hard for people to well, it used to be that you look at the same data and maybe have different positions, but now people have in their heads or in their social feeds actually just completely different data, even on things like vaccination, et cetera. It's kind of a nightmare. So if there's a way to create that reliable platform to facilitate, constructive discourse, cooperation amid difference, it sure feels like a great place to be going. I'm going to show a couple more things that Taisha had set up too, just to give across what's possible here. Yeah, this was another one of your experiences. Maybe you could describe what's happening.
Sure. I'll just wait for it to load onto the screen, unless it's just me that can't see it.
It's playing right now, I think.
Okay. All right. I still can't see it, but I'm assuming what you're looking at now is sort of this collaborative experience in Wellington. It's just a short clip, so Andy, you might have to keep replaying it. But what we've got here is, I mean, this is in a headset now, right? But we've got two people collaborating in this virtual world, and I mean, this is real data from Wellington, New Zealand. Obviously, another example of a city that's very forward thinking in this respect as well.
So you could do a walking tour of.
So you can do a walking tour. Exactly. You can experience. Exactly. You can experience this data again at human scale. And I think when you do that, that is when it becomes more real. And I mean, here's another example. It is dark here, obviously, because this is emergency evacuation route simulation. But we're looking at evacuation routes out of a building. So yeah, if there is an earthquake or a tsunami, what are you to do? It also helps to train emergency response crews. So if they can go into a virtual world ahead of time, that is a replica of the real world, they can already know, okay, this is this in this building, these are the evacuation routes, this is where I can find fire hydrants, or whatever else they need to look for, and already know when they walk in what they're going to be expecting. And that's the power of data, and the power of immersively experiencing your data.
Yeah, that feels super important, and getting, it would be wonderful to think that congressional hearings someday could have that quality, so you could walk
right
lawmakers through a situation.
Absolutely.
And this is why we need to change building code or the like. I would love to think that can happen. I imagine you both agree. But we're still, for the moment, we're mostly stuck with less perfect situations. The thing that I just want to close out with a few things. One seems to be that the pull is there. I think Kelsey, who from ESRI, was telling me earlier about that ESRI is working in the state of Maine, my state, and I'm my friends at Maine Monitor, who do a lot of good climate reporting, have after the Texas flooding said Maine towns are regulating development in flood zones. And part of what they have to do is to sell the community on something very inconvenient. As Alan said, even the phrase "managed retreat" is awful. Years ago, I did a webcast exploring, well, what's a better word? What's a better phrase for that? Resilient development. It's all negative. You're taking away stuff, but if you can start to use these tools to make the case, that feels like a way forward. The Los Angeles Times did Roxana Shia there. She was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Maybe she was a finalist, I think, for an immersive sea level game that Californians could look at neighborhood by neighborhood. So we're kind of crawling toward actualization of what that Stop Disasters game from 15 years ago is doing in a very crude way. And it's good to know ESRI is out there, and folks, I assume, could track down Alan. You're easy to find using social media or just Google to get in touch about Kauai's experience and aspirations. There's one last element of one of the presentations, Alan, that you showed that I just want to get back to. Hold on one second, if I can. There's no producer behind the scene here.
And I'll say I'm really impressed how quickly you're able to navigate between all these things.
Yeah.
Right.
5 years of doing it. So one thing that's interesting here is the role of that basin in creating the imbalanced threat and future landscape. This gets back to what I said earlier about grandfathered homes with fire vulnerable materials, and how that played a role in some of the terrible fires we've seen in Colorado and California. This tool, this mapping sure shows pretty vividly the cost of certain kinds of coastal development. Is it possible to use, I mean, you're talking forward looking, it's hard to undo something like a yacht basin, but it certainly makes a point here that helps to inform people about what creates coastal dynamics that you have to live with. I don't know if that's something that feels like it's a possibility to start to really say certain things that already exist are a bad idea. It's happening with dams to a certain extent. The Klamath River is being released from its concrete boundaries. Is this something that you think can also be used to sort of identify dynamics in ways that can help communities change?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a small boat harbor, mostly actually for fishermen on the west side of Kauai. And it is interesting because I think there's a discussion about maladaptation, about in different areas about trying to not let nature take its course, or use certain types of tools that may not be the best solution. Trying to understand what's best short-term, near-term, long-term is very challenging, and oftentimes requires coastal engineers and a lot of other folks who can do these different types of models. But what this really also shows, and where I mentioned earlier, the highest wash, the highest wave, the highest tide is the beginning of the state property. The challenge here is that by putting in a hardened shore, you may be impacting your neighbor's private property. And so it becomes a private nuisance issue. And so that was oftentimes and that is a specific legal term. And that is actually what justified the state to prevent the additional hardening of coastal shorelines in Hawaii. There are exceptions for larger projects, things that have lots of study, but generally speaking, the situation that you've seen on the right of that like mesh that homeowners put down to try to preserve their sand, their rocks, those types of informal actions are no longer allowed.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, what's that? There was a paper on the end of stationarity a long time ago that everything is in flux, and we have to get comfortable with change to a certain extent, and that will mean some inconvenient changes in old, long-standing norms. Actually, right where we live here on an inlet in Maine, we've had pretty bad coastal erosion from some anomalous storms, winter storms, and we're working on some living shoreline stuff, but it's mainly slowing things down. It's not giving in. It's not trying to impede nature doing its thing.
Yep.
Well, I can't thank you both enough for coming in at the 2 inconvenient hours. You from Zurich, Switzerland, and Kauai, one at the end of a day, the one at the beginning of a day. Thanks so much for being part of this conversation on Sustain What. There's lots more to discuss. Anytime ESRI or has a new tool out, think about coming on to talk about it. And hopefully we won't have to get in touch with Alan when there's one of those hazards manifests. There are many of them there and elsewhere. This is Andy Revkin in Wabanaki Territory in Down East Maine. And this has been Sustain What, from Kauai to your town, how tech can cut climate and coastal risks and make us all a little more comfortable with the future that involves a lot of change and requires a lot of data and monitoring and preparedness to address. Thanks for being part of it. Hold on one second. And anyone who's watching, you can share the links that you've been watching on with anyone. They all become the archive video. And